What makes a good immersive world building? Well, plenty of things, but I would argue that there are at least three things that are fundamental and contribute the most to the feeling of immersion. First one is a semblance of realism, so how the world works and if it's consistent with its own rules. Second is a breathing, living world. So does the world exist and function without a player, and are things happening on their own? And the third one is a logical geopolitical dynamics. Factions and groups of people act on their own according to their goals, ideologies, or events unfolding and changing the factional landscape. Gothic 2 excels at all three of them, but especially the last one, as very few games, or any piece of media in that matter, rarely do this, and when they do, it's usually very shallow and surface level. The game does what all sequels should do. It takes what the first game did well and greatly expands upon it, and its world building is also an area that saw quite a lot of expansion, with some costs. Gothic 2 takes place around a month after the events of the first game. The magical barrier is destroyed, and the prison valley that was the main setting of the previous game is finally free, for the most part. If you want to check the world building of the first game and see how it connects to Gothic 2, you can see my previous video. The map, just like in the first game, is a physical item that you need to acquire. The playable map is almost twice the size of Gothic 1, and now we know that the prison colony from the first game was just a part of the bigger island of Khorinis that belongs to the Kingdom of Myrtana. The island of Khorinis is divided into roughly three major areas: the Prison Valley, which is the region where the first game took place, city of Khorinis and the areas around, and Jorkandar, which is an area added by the expansion Night of the Raven. But we will not talk about this one today, as it is a completely different beast on its own. Since the first game never elaborated about anything outside of the Prison Valley, with a small exception of mentioning the premise of the colony in the intro, we are now presented with a much bigger context. Khorinis is an island which belongs to the Kingdom of Myrtana. It is also its main source of magic ore, a sort of magical metal that can be forged into powerful weapon and armor, which we had a chance to wield in the first game in the form of Uriziel, the most powerful weapon in the game. The island is very mountainous, with just a couple of smaller, flatter areas where the vast majority of people lives. These are our game regions. This can be a small thing, but it's an appreciated detail of its world building, that people tend to settle en masse in a very small living areas rather than to scatter in hilly or mountainous terrain. We can see that, for example, in our world with Japan, where the vast majority of people live in a couple of small flatlands and concentrate that. We also know that the island is mostly unexplored, as later we learn that there is another area, Jorkandar, that the pirates used to hide. In the south there is a big mountain range that is completely unexplored, which is mentioned a couple of times by NPCs, environmental storytelling and plot suggestions. Khorinis, the area, not the city and not the island, I know it's confusing, but bear with me. Despite being an area of farmable flatlands, it still has a lot of verticality to it. After Gothic 1, the designers really mastered the vertical design of the map, which again is a very smart way to increase the feeling of space without actually adding space. You can walk for like 2 or 3 minutes and still be roughly in the same place on the map purely because of, the elevation. This verticality and small mountainous areas creates roadblocks which drastically increase the walking distance, even if the actual map distance is very small. Like here, for example, if you want to walk from point A to point B on the map, despite those 2 points being so close to each other, you need to walk quite a bit of a distance to reach it. And you can take any 2 points, and very often you would need much more distance than the map portrays. This, combined with a fully handcrafted environment full of content, makes the rather small map of Khorinis full of life and interesting places. The once peaceful area of Khorinis, with its port town, is now plagued with bandits and overall unrest caused by the destruction of the magical barrier that surrounded the prison valley. The convicts that were trapped under the barrier in the previous game now swooped into the area, and deprived of resources and still being labeled as criminals, many of them became bandits, pillaging the farmlands and attacking wandering traders. After the sudden stop of the steady income of the magical ore, the paladins, the elite warriors of the kingdom of Myrtana, sailed across the sea and arrived at the shores of Khorinis, taking over the command of the city and sending a mining expedition to the now barren prison valley to resume the mining operation. And that's the setup of the world for this game. Now, the three major factions of Gothic 2 are quite different from the previous game. We have the port town of Khorinis on the far western side, the most powerful faction in the region, with control over the trade and the only port in the island, the Monastery, which is the religious seat of the fire mages who worship Innos, and Onar's farmlands, an independent oligarch farmer who employed some of the more organized convicts from the prison valley as mercenaries, with Lee, the previous leader of the new camp, as their military commander. Starting with the centerpiece of the game, the port town of Khorinis. It's a small town that used to be quite rich, since Khorinis was a sea link between the kingdom of Myrtana and the main source of magical ore taken from the valley and transported via Khorinis ports. The trade was booming, but then the destruction of the barrier came with its many problems. The sudden stop of ore flow, sudden spike of banditry in the region, and now the paladins who confiscated all ships for the purpose of war efforts. All of that made the town far less appealing for trade. Khorinis is a standard medieval town and is divided into three districts: the Port District, the Lower City, and the Upper City. Those areas are very distinct, with the Port District being the poorest one and also the most dangerous, with no militia or paladin presence, with a small exception guarding the huge galleon in the southern docks. This is also the seat of the criminal activity of the town, the central tavern being the gossip space and a hub for information brokers. There is also a illegal fighting ring, a brothel, and deep beneath all of that, in the sewers, the Thief Guild's headquarters. The lower city, on the other hand, is far more safe and hosts artisans, craftsmen, traders, and other middle-class citizens. And the upper city, which have a restricted access and can only be entered by town militia, paladins, or nobility. This is the safest area, with beautiful architecture and richer than any place in the island. This place also holds the paladins' headquarters, who currently govern the town with the benevolence and Innos' blessing. The social structure here is not really that out of the ordinary fantasy town. The poor docks, the middle-class lower city, militia keeping the guarding duty, and the upper town being the posh area for only select few. However, that is only on the surface. Gothic 2 takes a small spin on the entire trope and adds some internal struggles and small political unrest. The paladins, who arrived on a huge war galleon, took over the city governance by force of authority and military intimidation. Desperate to resume the inflow of magical ore, they sent expedition to the mining valley, and because of that they need the resources. So they confiscate quite a lot of things from the commoners, shopkeepers and farmers all around, which in turn, naturally, causes some unrest and discontent. Some traders leave the city, some farmers rebel, which in turn force the paladins to calm down the populace by giving free accommodation for newcomers and traders, or give up free beer in the lower city plaza. The town militia draft more and more people to its ranks to combat the wild banditry and to more effectively confiscate goods from the farmers around the city. With the paladins busy sending mining expedition and militia spread thin combating banditry and confiscating goods, the crime flourished in the docks. We can see that the situation in town is getting worse and worse by the day, and the mountain of ever-growing problems spread the town might very thin, which is the only reason why they cannot combat the rising protesting farmers. In total, the town of Khorinis hosts 160 people, and since you guys liked the comparison to Skyrim previously, let me compare it to the Imperial City from Oblivion, the capital city of an enormous empire which hosts 313 people, which means that port town of Khorinis have only half that of the Imperial capital. I also didn't count the farmers around the Khorinis, as they do not live inside the city. Speaking of farmers, next we have Onar's farm. This one is strange as it doesn't have any strict borders. Onar's farm is just a collective of farmlands that belongs to a farming oligarch named Onar, who decided to rebel against the tyranny and incompetence of the Khorinis nobles and paladins, who cannot protect his lands from the banditry and raiders, and not only that, they also keep confiscating their food supplies. Since Onar's farmlands are located so far away from the city, in the southeastern Pan, very close to the mountain range between them and the prison valley, logistically it's very hard for the town militia to protect them, so the oligarch decided to employ some of the more reasonable convicts from the colony as mercenaries. Those mercenaries are, well, mercenaries from the new camp, with Lee as their commander. And since Lee used to be the king's general, who was convicted as a political scapegoat, he is now in revenge mode, and this alliance with Onar against the king's forces is playing into his revenge. However, this is just an alliance of convenience. Onar is protected from the banditry, and his crops and sheep can be confiscated by the king's troops. And Lee can have a stable position, constant supplies without doing any banditry or raiding, and also have a position of power when negotiating his and his men pardon, as they are still treated as criminals. To add to this, there is also Silvio, a mercenary from the south who came with his own band to join Lee. However, he is not willing to be just a mercenary under Lee's command, so there's a constant tension between Lee's loyalists and Silvio's group within the mercenaries. The farmers under Onar's grip are not that free from tithe and confiscation. The mercenaries act like the town's militia in that regard, it's just that the crops go to a different party. As for the mercenaries themselves, their equipment is very mishmashed. A lot of them comes from the new camp, so they still have their junk armor. However, Onar's farm have access to a master blacksmith, Bennett, and therefore the mercenaries are equipped with quite good weaponry. Overall, there is around 60 to 70 people that belongs to Onar's farmlands. It's hard to be precise, as other farms around are in constant shambles between Onar's and Khorinis' influence. And the last one, the Monastery. This one is pretty straightforward. It's a small secluded monastery of fire mages, who are also religious leaders, the priests of Enos, the god of fire, life, law and order in Myrtana's pantheon. The monastery is isolated geographically and hard to access. Only the mages themselves, or paladins, can enter the compound. As any religious institution, they live from donations, mostly done by novices who want to join, and using their hard work to produce wine, which they sell in taverns all around the area. The monastery do not play any major roles in terms of trade and economy of the region, but their political standing is still very strong, as fire mages are considered the prosecutors and judges in Myrtana's law, as Enos is the god of order. Therefore, both Onar and the city of Khorinis respect them and don't want to go into their bad side, especially that those prosecutors are very powerful magic users. Of course, the Church of Enos stay neutral in the conflict, as it's purely political in nature. In total, the monastery hosts 27 people, which is reasonable for this type of institution. I said that the monastery is the last faction, and that is correct in terms of joinable factions. But I decided to count one more thing, the Valley Castle. For that, we need to get through the mountain pass to the mining colony, the area that we spent last game trying to escape. Gothic 2 have one of the most powerful homecoming moments in all media that I can remember. The prison valley is also a part of the world in Gothic 2, however it has changed quite a lot. Everything is bleak and desolate. You can smell the dark and dangerous atmosphere all around. There's almost no place that is safe, and even in those places you feel anxious. Everything in this valley is designed to feel like the area wants you dead. Orcs and dangerous beasts roam around everywhere. The old camp from the previous game is devastated. Everything is bleak and desperate, and in the center of all of this is the Valley Castle, which used to be the center of the old camp, which hosts the Paladins mining expedition. Even though it's not a joinable faction, this is an important player in the dynamics of the island, as it holds the Paladins' main reason to stay here. The castle was attacked by dragons and now is besieged by orcs. The mining camps around can barely mine enough ore due to the dangers of the area. Inside the castle walls there is 47 survivors still holding their ground, and that castle, this expedition, is key to the wavering stability of power in the island. As you can see, the political dynamics are now the focus of world building in this game. There is much less focus on faction representation based on their equipment, as the plot no longer takes place in the prison valley. You can see the dynamics are heavily related to geography. Onar's farmlands are situated very close to the main road to the mining valley, which poses a constant threat to the paladins' logistics with the mining expedition. Also, only the further away farms could rebel against Khorinis' forces, with those closer to town being unable due to the proximity and possible fast reaction from the town. Khorinis is now the centerpiece, and no matter which faction you will join, you will spend quite a lot of time in the town. The king's forces, paladins, and town militia are by far the strongest and dominating power. However, internal struggles, crime rate within the city, rampant banditry, the mining expedition, and now the revolt of Onar with his mercenaries makes them stretch very thin. Unable to focus their forces, other factions take advantage of this opportunity. Lee's mercenaries are vastly outnumbered by the forces of Khorinis, but then Khorinis cannot really focus on them to deal with this problem, especially that Lee is not some random bandit. He used to be a general in the king's army. He knows their tactics, and he approached this proxy war with calm and patience. Also, using brute force on the farmers will have even more negative consequences for the paladins, who already have issues with support from the common people. You can see all around that Onar's mercenaries are trying to expand his influence to other farms to starve Khorinis. The town's militia, on the other hand, try to push back and intimidate farmers who support Onar. As you can see, there is quite a lot of tension, a lot of soft aggression between those two powers. Later on, we see how the depressing state of the mining expedition influenced the dynamics. The paladins send more reinforcements to the valley. Lee's mercenaries, who could use that opportunity to put some pressure on the town, is also hampered with the sudden interest of dragon hunting from his men, and loses some of them to their own expedition to the valley to hunt those mythical creatures. In addition to that, the forces of orcs start appearing more and more frequently in those lands. We see more scouts and dark magicians who intimidate people around. With each chapter of the game, the situation becomes more and more and more tense. But what about the natural world building? What about the forests? Well, as dark and menacing they were in the first game, now they lost some of this dark charm. However, they do look more like actual forests now, with very dense vegetation, and just because they no longer are so dark and menacing doesn't mean they are not dangerous. Oh no. Because of this dense vegetation, your vision is obscure quite a lot, and you are more oblivious to the dangers lurking within. You will often hear strange noises, and you will never be sure about where they come from, which add to the sense of danger. I would say that the forests are better overall. They feel more natural and are still very unwelcoming and dangerous, but they did lose some of its previous dark charm. As for the other more organic world building, there are some visible issues here and there. For example, we know that the monastery gets some of its cash from selling wine, which is nice and all to know how certain factions get their resources from, especially that most games never bother to do this, but where do they get their wine from? We see that the novices are working on it, and we see the wine stored in the cellar in the monastery, but to make wine you need grapes, and there's not a single grape plantation in the entire island. The trade with the outside world also stopped some time ago, so they don't get it from overseas. We see that the monastery have some crops, but this looks like wheat, and it's just a garden, not an actual farmland or plantation. Another thing is that we know that the mountain pass in the south is the only pathway to get in and out of the prison valley, but it's guarded by like 2 guys. There is no outpost or bigger fortification, it's just a wooden wall made of planks. Nothing is being constructed, even though there is a major orc threat just beyond the pass. Another one, why is there a symbol of Xardas Tower in the map? As far as we know, it was drawn by the local cartograph. And according to the game, the tower is hidden and appeared by magical means only recently. So how does he know about the tower? And another one, we know about a caravan being ambushed on the way to the tavern. We speak with the survivor, and he explained to us that he wanted to avoid the bandits guarding the bridge by taking another route under the bridge. But the bandits were apparently very desperate and jumped from the bridge to the road below to rob him. Well, no. How are they still alive if they jumped from such a high place? All of those things are not that big of an issue on their own, but they do add up and damage the believability of the world. Contrary to Gothic 1, here we have far more context for the world around Khorinis. We get to know the names of some of the regions belonging to the Kingdom of Myrtana, like Verant. We get to know about the Southern Islands, and in Khorinis we even get to meet an immigrant from these islands.
Who are you?
My name is
We also get to know about the mighty alien dwarf. Seriously, what the hell? Overall, Gothic 2 expanded much over the formula of the first game, mostly mechanically, but also with more in-depth political dynamics and relations. However, we start to see some small cracks in the dam, which will get even bigger with the expansion. And then the absolute disaster which was Gothic 3. This is of course just part 1, as in the next video I will discuss Jarkandar and all content related to the expansion, Night of the Raven. Since back in the day we used to have actual huge expansions, not half-hour DLCs that cost $30. But that will be all for today. I hope you really enjoyed this analysis. There is still a lot of talk about the world building in Gothic 2, but we would be sitting here for the next 4 hours or so if I were to dig into every single detail. Please like, subscribe and comment to appease the gods of algorithm, and I hope to see you on part 2.